Hello, welcome to my brief lesson on shading and curtains. Just soak up the corn humor while I move on to the next slide. So why shade in a greenhouse? We've touched on shade a few times. Temperature is obvious. If the greenhouse is getting hot, we want to block the sun from getting into the greenhouse. You've seen this picture. We talked about it at the beginning of the course with sunlight coming in to the greenhouse and heating objects, heating the plants, heating the air, and then those objects re-radiating longer wavelengths, which some get trapped in the greenhouse and some escape to the atmosphere. So if we can block the sunlight, none of this heat gain happens in the greenhouse. And we can keep it cooler. Light intensity. So we talked about near the end of our section on light, we talked about when there's too much light, this process called solarization, where the sunlight is so intense that the electrons that are produced on the surface can't be absorbed and they start causing damage. And we see burn, like in hostas, maybe on a jade here that was normally in the house and you put on the deck into the bright sun, that kind of thing. Sometimes we see situations where part of the leaf is shaded and part of it is exposed and it gets burnt. So photooxidative damage, otherwise known as solarization, this intense sunlight is causing photosynthesis to go crazy. Remember, it's like a conveyor belt. And if the electrons are coming off faster than we can consume them to make sugar, those electrons end up damaging tissues like DNA and cell membranes and things like that, which cause cells to die. We also talked with the light in the light talk about wavelengths effects, right? So as the sun is setting at the end of the day, the blue light is scattered off axis, and yellow and greens as well. They don't travel as far through the atmosphere, but the red and far red do make it through the atmosphere. So just as the sun's going down, we get that far red flash. So we can prevent stretch, for example, by closing our curtains at the end of the day to block that. This is an important one, managing humidity. Typically, we think of reducing humidity. So basically, if the curtains are closed, we can keep the humid air away from the glass. If we open the curtains, it goes up and hits the glass. This picture here is showing condensation forming on glass. So that's very helpful for removing humidity, but you can also maintain humidity by keeping the curtains closed and keeping the air away from the glass. So depending on the type of film covering your greenhouse, if it's glass, it's very good at causing condensation. If it's poly, it still condenses, but not as quickly as it would with glass. So this is glass on this side, and this is poly on this side. So obviously a better insulator is not going to it's not going to be as cold, so you don't get as much condensation on it. So on the right here, this screen here, you'll notice it's got little holes in it. These dots are holes, and they're perforated regularly. And this screen is actually a humidity screen, and it's meant to keep the air away from the glass to maintain humidity. So for example, cucumbers like high humidity. And in the winter, when we're adding heat in the greenhouse to keep it warm, it's too easy for that warm air to rise up and hit the glass and turn into condensation, which then drips down and the air ends up dry, which we don't want. So a humidity screen creates a bit of a barrier to keep that away from the glass to maintain higher humidity levels. So again, I've got a couple of examples here. You've got a curtain closed and the plants are transpiring and that humidity is staying below the curtain. So we're maintaining an ideal humidity. So it's not a universal rule, but it's pretty universal. It's close that most plants enjoy being between 70 and 80% humidity. If you go below these numbers, the stomata have difficulty opening because there's too much water leaving the guard cells. And so that ends up making the stomata a little more closed, which restricts airflow in and out of the leaf. So you get too dry, you actually restrict photosynthesis and the plants don't yield as much. And if you go too high in humidity, then there's not much motivation for transpiration to happen out of the leaf. And so the entire movement of phloem slows down in the plant and also growth slows down. So there is this ideal humidity range, and that's where curtains play an important role in managing that humidity. We want to make sure the plants are what we call active, where they're not stressed from being too dry or they're not stagnant from being too humid. Of course, when you open the curtain, that moist air immediately warms, the warm air rises, goes up to the top, hits the cold glass, and condensation happens. Now, I should point out, obviously, if it's a warm summer's day and it's 96% humid outside and 96 inside the greenhouse, there's no exchange that's going to happen because there's no gradient. So dehumidification mostly with curtains mostly counts on the glass being cold, which means fall, winter, and spring, but not in the summer. Whoops. Ideally, to prevent the scenario I was just talking about, you would put a sensor above and below the curtain. So up here would be a sensor, and then down below the curtain would be a sensor. And then as a grower, you would know that, hey, if the air above the curtain is no different in humidity, then there's no point in going through this exercise. It's not going to do anything. So that's something that a lot of greenhouses like to do, is to track temperatures above and below the curtain. Another reason for using shade is for saving energy. This you'll see here is aluminum strips that are woven into the cloth, and they're very effective at reflecting infrared heat. So everything is radiating heat. The floor is radiating heat. The plants, that's traveling up as a wavelength, and then it hits the aluminum on the energy curtain and bounces back into the greenhouse. And the heat is not lost. Now, where the curtain's open, that heat can travel up and hit the plastic, either pass through it or conduct through it, and then re-radiate as the plastic's warm on the other side, and it escapes into the atmosphere. So by preventing the light from even getting to the film or the glass, we bounce the energy back into the greenhouse and we can reduce our heating costs. So energy curtains are very, very efficient at retaining heat. Oftentimes, energy curtains are so efficient that when you open them first thing in the morning in the winter, there's ice all over the inside of the greenhouse above it. So very little heat escaped. And I don't know if you can see in this picture, it might be helpful. The curtain here is actually going down into a pocket, and behind here, it loops over a bar and then hangs over an edge and drops. And that creates a positive seal. So as the curtain moves left to right along this trough, the air can't escape around the curtain and escape into the top. We call this a boot. And the curtain has got you'll see there's some weights in here that hang it over this edge, and it rides on this edge here back and forth to create an airtight gap so that it can slide, but hot air can't escape. So that keeps it nice and buttoned down. You'll notice in this particular greenhouse, there's actually no energy curtain on the sidewall. So heat's going to go straight through the sidewall. Some greenhouses, a lot of modern big ones have sidewalls that roll up as well as the top. So all sides are covered by the energy curtain. Now, the energy curtain will also offer a barrier for moisture, so it can be used for humidity management. It can also be used to reduce light intensity. So you'll see that there's clear and aluminum. So You buy these based on a percentage of shade, which dictates how thick the aluminum strips are. So some light gets through these in-between strips. So it's not like when you close it, it's black. Depending on your needs, those can be thinner or bigger gaps. So this is showing you lots of different types of curtains. This one actually even blocks quite a bit of light. It looks like it's aluminumized on one side, black on the other. These are thinner strips, maybe a bit more diffuse light. These are not aluminized, but they're like thick and thin, so there's varying degrees of shade. This is a solid cloth. There's some cloths that are called light abatement that block all the light so it doesn't escape into the city at night and irritate people. Those are becoming law now in a lot of parts around the world because people want to go to bed and have a dark night. They don't want lights glowing like crazy from neighboring farms. So a lot of greenhouses have put in light abatement screens that double as energy curtains. Another reason for having curtains is, as we've talked about this as well, was for light diffusion. So you'll notice the glass in this greenhouse is clear and the sky is very blue. And then this screen is translucent. And what's happening here is the sunlight, which would come through the glass completely linearly and would create hard shadows, ends up coming through and hitting a curtain, which causes it to diffuse and go off in all sorts of different angles, reducing shade and allowing light to penetrate further down into the crop. So these are very popular in large vegetable greenhouses where they're looking to make the most use of the crop, because these crops are tall and diffuse light will penetrate down into the foliage and allow the leaves at the bottom to contribute to photosynthesis. So you get higher yields. They are definitely very helpful. The other thing that is really cool about these is they double as a humidity screen. So when they're closed, you can maintain higher levels of humidity to keep the plant active in case there's any water stress happening. It's not a curtain, but it is a shade method, and we have talked about it, but let's just go over it again. Whitewashing is a common strategy in the summer months to prevent the most heat gain. One of the main reasons why we do it is because sunlight is reflected before it enters the greenhouse, just like those tropical greenhouses I talked about. So if you can get the light reflected before it enters the greenhouse, your greenhouse is that much cooler. So obviously this is actually the most common one used in around that I know of in Ontario. In the old days, you could take lime and mix it with some glue in different ratios and spray it on and let it dry. No one does that anymore. Someone with a brush cleaning it because they're trying to get it off in the fall. It would be really hard to get that off. Not ideal. These days, we're really uptight about getting maximum light in the greenhouse. This is an automated sprayer that travels along and sprays the glass. They also can use it to clean the glass. It's got like a rotary brush. Whitewash, a couple of things to know. These questions will be on the midterm. When whitewash is dry, it reflects quite a bit of light. And when it's wet, it transmits a fair amount of light. So when it's dry, if you're looking up here at the top, it's a sunny day, it's very, very kind of milky white. And if it was a rainy day, it actually becomes more translucent and you can kind of see somewhat through it. So it's pretty cool how it's formulated these days. There's actually quite a few different types of whitewash on the market, all for different, reflecting infrared to cut down on heat, to shift the spectrum a bit, like you name it. They have a lot of different strategies. You can also vary the concentration as you spray it on, and some people like a heavy shade, some people like a light shade. All depends on what your crop is and what its light needs are. If you think you can hit your DLIs with a heavy shade, go for it. Removing it requires either acid or natural rainfall or snow, depending on the formulation you buy. And it's important to pay attention to that so that you're removing it when you need to before winter. Because if you don't have it off by winter, you need all the light you can get. That's a big problem. Just like the whitewash retractable external shade is probably the absolute best for a cool greenhouse. Here we have a tropical greenhouse. The shade is above the greenhouse, so radiation hits the curtain and bounces back into the sky, and a lot less heat is in the greenhouse. So you can manage a much cooler climate. They've got sidewalls that roll down for venting, and they've got shade above the greenhouse. This is a really simple strategy for cooling a hobby greenhouse just by putting a tarp over top. So anything that blocks the light before it gets into the greenhouse is going to be more effective. I don't know if you remember these old Land Rovers, but they have a double roof on them. They didn't have air conditioning, but this double roof, what ended up happening was the sunlight would reflect off the first roof, and there's an air gap between the roof and the next roof, which would let air flow in and then flow out. And the cab would actually be quite a bit cooler on a hot summer's day because of that. So that's an example of external shade in a greenhouse. That's the same model. So internal shade is the standard for North America because of snow. We talked about this at one time in the class. If we had that outside the greenhouse, the snow would just tear it apart, just destroy it. So we have to have it inside, which means above the greenhouse is always very hot. All this area is very hot. If it's a sunny day. If it's a cold day, then that air can be quite cold. Here's another picture showing a diffuse humidity curtain. This is a link. You can click on that if you go to the PowerPoint thing, not in the YouTube. And it will take you to Svensson, which is probably the biggest brand in shade, and they can peruse all the different styles of curtains that they have. Just looking at this slide out of curiosity, do you notice that they've got sticky cards conveniently way above the crop? I don't know if that's a good idea, that far away from the crop. But hey, maybe it works for them. Maybe there's enough upward air current in their greenhouse that the bugs will be attracted. I don't know. Not how I would do it. Shading for, now this is a new element to this lesson because I am trying to move plant empowerment strategies into the course. We talked about temperature here already, but technically shade for temperature is typically thought of as the climate that the greenhouse has, so inside the air temperature. But what's actually more important is crop temperature. So in this thermal image of a rose, you can see that there's quite a bit of heat in the bud and the leaves are quite cool. So there's heat storage in objects and different densities of objects, and maintaining crop temperature is critical. And with shade, we have to try to do that. So one thing to keep in mind is that anything that's warm, so this rose is warm, it's giving off heat. So it's radiating heat out into the air, okay? And that's one way that it could give up its heat. So looking at the scale that's been printed on here, the flower itself is 31.8 degrees Celsius and the sepal is 25.6. Pretty big difference in temperature. Maybe you can guess why that is. I'll give you 2 seconds. The sepals are a modified leaf that has stomata, so it's transpiring, where the rose flower itself does not have stomata. And especially when it's wound tightly at a bud stage, it's very difficult for it to transpire and cool through transpiration, so it gets hotter. So that's what my second point here is, that heat loss is supposed to lead to reduced respiration. And basically, if we have, sorry, let me start that again. Plants lose heat through transpiration, and if they can't transpire, they overheat, right? So the flip side is that we need to maintain some heat so that they grow properly. So with plant empowerment, what often happens is the growers make decisions on whether to open and close curtains not necessarily by air temperature, but by crop temperature, because we want to make sure the crop is warm enough that it's actively transpiring at a rate that matches the current light levels and whatnot. So heat loss from a crop will reduce transpiration and reduce growth. And so what does this mean for a curtain? Well, it means that if we're losing heat from the crop, that it will slow down. So there's a number of things that kind of complicate this topic. And let me skip ahead to the next slide. Let me remind you that when an object is hot, like this fire, it can convect heat through hot air rising. It can radiate heat through infrared light, right? Or it conducts along an object that is conductive, not an insulator. We'll skip this one. So in terms of a greenhouse, our crop is warm. Everything is warm unless it's at absolute zero, which is minus 273 Kelvin or Celsius, something like that. So even snow in the middle of the winter is warmer than the atmosphere, so it's actually radiating some heat. I know that's hard to believe, but yeah. So when we're talking about radiating heat, if I have a crop in the greenhouse, it's actually radiating heat. And it's going to radiate to structures and objects all around it. And an important thing to consider here is that radiation of heat is governed by whether there's a gradient or not. So let's say this crop is 24 degrees Celsius, okay? And the curtain up here is 24 degrees Celsius, and the sidewall is 24 degrees Celsius. Is this crop going to radiate much heat? There's no gradient, so it can't radiate from 24 to 24. So what ends up happening is it's static. It's static. Its temperature stays the same. Now, if the crop is 24 degrees Celsius and the curtain is 20, right? Now we have a gradient, and it's going to radiate heat to the object above, which is the curtain. And if the wall is 20, it's going to radiate towards the wall. Don't you love my writing? It's awesome. I bought a tablet and I just got basically lazy, and I'm sorry. So let's say we have a crop, it's radiating heat, and we're okay with that. Or it's radiating heat and we're concerned that it's cooling off too much. We can use a curtain to help us make decisions of how to manage the crop temperature. So, for example, let's say crop radiates to the greenhouse greenhouse radiates to the sky, and the sky either reflects that heat back or it disappears into the atmosphere, depending on whether it's cloudy or not. Now, this is kind of an abstract concept I'm trying to introduce here, but inherently, I think you're probably aware of how this works. Because if you think of frost on a cool night where there's no clouds, the temperature of the ground cools off much quicker because the heat radiates away into the atmosphere, causing the ground to cool and permitting frost to form. And if it's a cloudy night, the ground radiates its heat up into the atmosphere, and it's reflected back, which doesn't permit it from losing any net real loss of heat, and you don't get frost. So I know these are abstract concepts, but they are important because when we're trying to manage crop temperature, we need to make decisions that will be helpful for managing the crop itself, not just the air, okay? So I want you to start thinking more about crop temperature than air temperature. Now, we still measure air temperature, and we do that as an approximation of the crop, but it's still important as a grower to go around and check the temperature of the actual crop, like with a laser pointer thermometer or something like that, and get a sense of if my crop is stressed, is it transpiring enough? So we know a crop is happy if it's cooler than the air in the greenhouse, because we know it's transpiring, right? If it's at the same temperature as up here, if they are equal, then this is going to end up overheating. There's no gradient, transpiration stops, temperature starts to spike. The crop could actually end up even hotter than the air in the greenhouse. So it's really important to think about, what is my crop temperature? This is a slide I scanned from Wikipedia that talks about frost. So on a clear winter's night, we get cold air down on the surface, and on a cloudy night, the heat is radiated back to the surface and we don't get frost. It's an extreme example of what I'm talking about. Now, I want to introduce a new sensor that greenhouses have started using. Not everyone has them, but they are becoming more common for determining whether you have a heat loss situation from the greenhouse or not. It's called a pergiometer, and it's basically underneath the screen, and it points straight up through the greenhouse, straight up at the sky. And it measures the rate of heat radiating away from the greenhouse. So if it senses that the net heat loss, say on a cloudy day, is minimal, then it will let the curtain stay open. If it senses that there is excessive heat loss, it will close the curtain to keep the crop at its active temperature. Essentially, what we're talking about is closing the curtain on a cloudy day or not, or closing at the end of the day or not, early or late, depending on whether that time will be useful for the crop to grow or not. So especially in the winter months where it's overcast, there are situations where you may say, hey, you know what? We're actually better off if we pull the curtain shut, save the energy in the greenhouse, and maintain the crop at a temperature that is suitable for that light level. Now, you know from earlier in the course that if it's colder, it would be a lower temperature, right? So you may, if it's winter, let's say you may float this down to 18 degrees Celsius during the day, close the curtain because now you have low DLI. Whoops, can't see that. Low DLI. This is terrible. I'm going to try again. That is awful. So on a winter's night, we have a low arrow, D, L, I, daily light integral. So we don't need that much light. We can float the temperature down, and if it's not cloudy, close the curtain because we know that the crop otherwise will radiate its energy up to the curtain, which to the greenhouse, and then that to the atmosphere, and then ends up costing you money to heat the greenhouse to maintain the temperature. So if we're at an acceptable light level with the curtain closed because we've lowered our set points, we're okay. The pergiometer helps us make that decision. So we don't have one at the college. We're not major vegetable growers, so it's not an investment that we made, but it can be a very useful tool. A lot of vegetable growers do this because if they can save a couple of percentage points off their heating bill, they're going to do it. So if they can pull the curtain and have adequate light, especially with different lower shade level curtains, the pergiometer will tell them if they are in the right bracket for whether the curtain should be open or closed. So here it says tempting to leave the curtains open as long as possible at the end of the day, and the pergiometer tells you if it's worth losing excessive heat at the end of the day or not. So for example, if it's a really clear day and the sun's going down and it's, December, January, we already know we want to avoid that far red flash at the end of the day. But even sooner, when the sun is already low in the sky, it might make more sense based on the pergiometer to close the curtain earlier and save money on heating with gas. So again, pergiometer can help you make decisions about during the day, and it can also help you make decisions near the end or beginning of the day, sort of. Usually just the end of the day is what we're talking about. And this last slide is just a good visual reminder of all the ways that greenhouses can gain and lose heat, right? So we talked a lot about radiation to the sky today. They can convect. So if there's a wind blowing across the greenhouse, it picks up heat from the greenhouse and warms the air. We know that the crop, we talked about that today too, the crop can radiate to the actual greenhouse structure, or it can radiate to the curtain, which in turn radiates it to the structure, which then in turn radiates to the sky. Sort of, you kind of, hopefully you're getting this sense or this picture of what everyone is just giving off heat. So your body is radiating to the air. If the air is hot, your body can't radiate, you feel hot, right? So we're having this heat spell. It's just like having a heat spell. You know, you're sitting at home, you're trying to binge watch your Netflix show, and it's too hot, so you turn the air conditioning on. Why? Because your body is trying to radiate heat to the air, but because the air is already warm, there isn't enough of a gradient, so you feel like you're overheating. Because in a sense, our body cools itself through perspiration, which is evaporation, which helps keep us comfortable. And if we can't perspire, it's just like a plant not able to transpire. The plant overheats. And if it overheats, then you have high respiration, which is consuming sugars and not supporting growth. So the sugars you've made end up just being burnt up in higher respiration. You can also conduct into the ground. You can convect with air inside the greenhouse with a fan spinning away. So you can move air across the plants to help them cool. All right, I think we are at saturation. So if you had struggled understanding the perigiometer, go over this again. There's some good articles in Greenhouse Canada if you Google them on perigiometers and how to use them. All right, hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you later.